A man is struck by a mysterious illness that shrinks him down to a fraction of his normal size. When the house cat suddenly wanders into the room, his legs nearly give out from sheer terror. A fishhook slashes across his waist, and before Paul can even tend to the wound, he grabs a nearby needle and makes a desperate run for it. But his frantic movement only triggers the cat's hunting instincts. He barely squeezes through a gap in the door before a paw comes swiping in right behind him. In the chaos, he loses his footing and tumbles into a wooden crate below, but luckily he is unhurt. Just then, his wife Elise comes downstairs. Paul screams for help with everything he has got, but she can't hear a thing. When she spots the blood-stained clothes, she assumes the worst, that the cat has killed her husband. Heartbroken, she scolds the little cat. Paul keeps shouting in desperation, but it is all for nothing. Paul is now trapped in the basement, a place crawling with spiders, mosquitoes, and ants, where the slightest misstep means death. How on earth is he going to make it out alive? Paul used to work at a shipbuilding company. He had a stable career and a happy family. But one beach vacation shattered everything. He was swimming in the ocean when the clouds above suddenly began spinning at high speed, forming a massive vortex. Paul felt dizzy and disoriented. He assumed it was just heat stroke and didn't think twice about it. 2 weeks later, something felt wrong. His clothes hung loose on his frame and his arms seemed shorter. He rushed to a clinic. The doctor confirmed it. His body was irreversibly shrinking. He'd been 6 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds. In just half a month, he'd dropped to 5'9" and 163 pounds. Every other health marker came back normal, so Paul initially chalked it up to aging. He never imagined the shrinking would keep getting worse. A month later, standing in the shower, Paul was gripped by terror. The shower head that once lined up perfectly with the top of his head now towered. Half a head above him, his wedding ring slid right off his finger. He was already shorter than his wife Elise. The couple finally grasped the severity of the situation and rushed to the best hospital in the area for a full examination. But every test came back the same. Aside from his continuously decreasing height and weight, nothing was abnormal. The doctors couldn't identify the cause, let alone offer any treatment. 2 months in, Paul had shrunk to the size of a small child. He could no longer work at the shipyard. The entire burden of supporting the family fell on Elise alone. His daughter Mia, who once looked up to her father for everything, began gazing at him with growing distance in her eyes. By the 3rd month, he was no bigger than the palm of a hand. They had a cat in the house, so Elise had to keep it locked outside to ensure Paul's safety. One day, a real estate agent showed up with potential buyers. Paul quickly hid under the bed. The agent told the buyers that Paul had gone missing, which was why Elise was selling the house. After they left, Paul and his wife erupted into a bitter argument. But he was so tiny that even screaming at the top of his lungs carried no weight at all. Elise broke down in tears, confessing that they were broke, and she had no other options. The fight escalated, and when Elise simply raised her hand a little too quickly, she nearly knocked Paul right off the table. Mia watched her helpless father and felt heartbroken. She gave him her toy dollhouse to live in. Paul was deeply moved. He picked up a little doll and danced with it, doing everything he could to make his daughter laugh. Later, Mia tried to pull him into a game of cat and mouse, but the commotion was overwhelming for someone his size. Seeing his distress, Mia quickly apologized. To move freely around the house, Paul fashioned climbing tools from a fishhook and fishing line. But danger was already creeping closer. The cat that had been locked outside found its way back in. And that is where our story began. Panicked, Paul flees into the cluttered basement, spotting a leaking pipe. He sees a glimmer of hope, a source of water to survive. He rinses the wound on his side, then collapses on the ground, exhausted, and falls into a deep sleep. The next morning, he hears Mia calling from upstairs. Paul races to the bottom of the staircase, shouting Elise and Mia's names over and over. But the towering steps loom like a wall, separating him from his family completely. He finds a piece of chalk and writes his name on the floor. Mia's beloved goldfish is kept down here in the basement. He is certain she'll come down eventually. But the dim basement is full of hidden dangers. He has to survive long enough for that moment to come. Paul finds a cardboard box to use as shelter. He punches a small hole in the side with a nail, crawls inside, and plugs the opening with a sponge to conceal himself. He spends the night curled up inside. He hasn't eaten in 2 full days, and hunger gnaws relentlessly at his body. Fortunately, there is a small piece of cake left on a mousetrap. Paul shoos away the ants swarming toward it, but figuring out how to disarm the trap is another challenge entirely. His first attempt doesn't quite do it. He doesn't put enough force into it to trigger the mousetrap. After adjusting his approach, he finally manages to pry it open on the second try. The cake is already going stale, but Paul has no other choice. Just as he is tearing into the cake, a spider silently appears behind him. He waves the nail frantically, shouting at the spider at the top of his lungs. By bluffing and putting on a brave front, he manages to scare the spider off. The next morning, Footsteps and voices drift down from upstairs. Paul bolts out of hiding, grabs a nail and a paperclip, and hammers them against the floor as hard as he can, desperately trying to make enough noise for Elise to hear. But this fleeting hope slips through his fingers completely. Defeated, Paul turns to alcohol for comfort. He chips open a crack in a bottle cork, uses the cap to scoop out wine, and drinks himself into oblivion. Through his blurred vision, he spots the spider perched on the rim of the fish tank, watching him. Fueled by liquid courage, he climbs up the tank and faces the spider head. He puts on a brave face, and to his surprise, it actually scares the spider off. He grins smugly, but the weapon slips from his hand. The spider lunges at him immediately. In a panic, Paul stumbles and falls into the fish tank. Luckily, the fish shows no interest in him, and he cheats death once again. He sprinkles some fish food into the water for the goldfish, and out of curiosity, even tastes a bit himself. But when he tries to head back to his cardboard shelter, the spider charges at him again. The spider backs him against the wall step by step. In his panic, the steel needle slips from his grasp. Just as the spider opens its gaping jaws, Paul snatches the needle back up in time and stabs at the spider again and again. Badly wounded, the spider retreats. To guard against ambush, Paul piles up scraps of paper around the entrance to his box and plans to light a fire to ward off the spider. But at his size, striking a match is nearly impossible. After several attempts, he finally manages to strike a match. Days pass, and Paul shrinks to half his size again. If he falls into the fish tank now, the goldfish could swallow him whole. That day, footsteps echo from upstairs once more. A stranger descends into the basement. The man's footsteps are like cannon blasts, leaving Paul dizzy and disoriented. He has no choice but to duck out of the way. Only after the person leaves does he dare to come out from under the stairs. What crushes him even more, the goldfish, his only companion in the basement, has been taken away. Then a mosquito drifts right in front of his face, and the realization hits him. He is now the same size as a mosquito. Watching it slip through the wire mesh over the window and fly outside, an idea sparks. He could escape the basement the same way. He climbs up the table leg, onto the tabletop, then sprints forward and leaps across to the wall. But the spider's web sits directly in his path. Paul tiptoes across, stepping carefully over the silk threads, but he brushes against one. The spider feels the vibration and scuttles toward him. Paul is too weak to fight. He freezes in place, and in his sheer terror, loses control of his bladder. The scent of urine makes the spider recoil and retreat. He survives by the thinnest of margins. Paul reaches the window and tries to squeeze through the gaps in the wire mesh, but he is still too large. He clings to the wire and endures another long night. At dawn, the stinging bite of ants jolts him awake. He is finally small enough. He wriggles through the mesh and escapes the basement at last. The world outside is so unfamiliar. He sees dewdrops hanging on blades of grass, each one roughly his own size. A moth drifts freely through the air. In this moment, Paul is struck by a profound realization. How precious his ordinary, unremarkable life had been all along. Cherishing every single moment you have. That is life's truest answer.